Hey folks, we're going to get started here. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar, Hartford to Bethlehem, Justice for Palestine. We have a great panel of folks today with us to discuss some of the questions surrounding this. There's a long and storied history of the movement for Black liberation in the United States and the struggle for justice in Palestine, collaborating, being in solidarity with each other, and you know, we're glad to have these folks on today to talk a little bit about that, talk about some of the recent ongoings in Palestine, and to discuss basically the situation and how the movement here for Black Lives and the movement for Palestinian rights and against the annexation of more and more Palestinian land by Israel are linked and can go together. So amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the Israeli state announced its intentions to immediately annex a large portion of the West Bank. This move is the latest in the continuing ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist settlement. The long list of recent atrocities include confiscating Palestinian medical equipment and the police murder of an unarmed autistic Palestinian man in Jerusalem. The fight against police brutality and oppression in the United States and Palestine are intimately connected. We know that police departments here regularly send police to learn from the IDF in Israel, and the IDF regularly sends people to teach the police department, different police departments here in the United States. I'm actually a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, and during my training to go to Iraq, we actually had a 3-day class that was taught by members of the IDF. You know, a bunch of lessons on how to keep what they call a combat mindset to ensure you don't become complacent, to basically, in my opinion, it was a class on how to dehumanize the enemy, in quotes. And I think that's exactly what's happening with police departments being trained by the IDF and things along that nature. So some questions we're going to talk about tonight is, why is Netanyahu choosing now to put forward annexation plans? What do they mean? And what kind of fight back is being organized? And how can we in the United States stand in solidarity? Tonight we have with us John Fussell, who's from the Tree of Life Education Fund. He's the vice president. We have Adam Antar, who's a community activist, a recent graduate from UConn School of Law. Alicia Strong, who's with a Yale graduate student and with New Britain Racial Justice Coalition. And we have Dan Piper from Socialist Resurgence, a candidate for state representative in District 1 and a Socialist Resurgence member and a longtime community activist in the Hartford area. So just again, want to thank everybody for joining, and we're going to give the floor to John Fussell to kind of lay out the current situation, and we hope you find this forum interesting. We're going to let all the participants speak, and then we'll take some Q&A. So John, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar. Let me start by saying that we are in turbulent times. America is undergoing a long overdue social justice awakening, sparked by the police murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Mubarak Solomon, Anthony Cruz, and so many, many more. At a time of escalating racism and police repression, we're also seeing unprecedented marches and demonstrations across this nation in support of Black Lives Matter. We're seeing new legislative initiatives aimed at abuse of police practices, and we're seeing a growing movement of young people yearning for equality of opportunity in jobs, education, and healthcare. It remains to be seen how far this new reckoning will take us, but as activists, we must seize on this moment to build the movement for social and economic justice here at home and abroad. Tonight, I'm going to focus on annexation of Palestinian land by the State of Israel. First, as a definition, annexation occurs when a state unilaterally takes possession over territory outside its domain and proclaims its sovereignty over that territory. This is really a polite way of saying theft, stealing land. When discussing Israeli annexation of Palestine, it's important to acknowledge that we live in a nation stained with annexation of indigenous peoples' land. Native American lands were stolen to make way for the expanding settler colonial nation that became the United States of America. Connecticut was once home to numerous Native American tribes, the Nipmunks, the Tunxis, the Polquinock, the Hamanasset, the Quiminapi, the Puntog, the Wewog, and the Pequot Mohegan. So settler colonial annexation is nothing new. It's been around a long time. Historically, settler colonial confrontations with indigenous people have ended in one of three ways. One, with the elimination or full subjugation of the native population, as in North America. Or two, with the defeat and the expulsion of the colonizer, as in Algeria. Or three, with the abandonment of colonial supremacy in the context of compromise, reconciliation, as in the case of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ireland. Annexation in the context of Israel-Palestine has gained renewed attention as a result of President Trump's ridiculous peace plan referred to as the deal of the century. It's more appropriately should be called the steal of the century, because this plan would annex another 30% of the West Bank Palestinian territory to Israel. Under this plan, over 75 Palestinian villages and Bedouin communities are to be annexed, affecting a total population of nearly 120,000 Palestinians. They are to be annexed, yet denied full citizenship rights. The segregated transportation system presently in place will be expanded. Most of the water resources rendered inaccessible to Palestinians will continue to be inaccessible, and much of the arable land will be annexed, destroying Palestinian agricultural economy. If you want to see a map, and I think Adam may be showing that map later on, you can go to a website called www.stopthewall.org and go to their map, and it will show you the effect of the annexation, of Trump's annexation plan. The renewed attention that annexation has received in Congress is at best naive on the part of Democrats and an embrace of racist colonialist supremacy on the part of Republicans. With regard to the Republicans, I refer to the letter dated June 22nd, 2020 to Netanyahu that was signed by 116 Republicans, emphasizing, quote, Israel has the right to make sovereign decisions independent of outside pressure, unquote. This really just expresses the Republican approval of Israeli annexation of Palestinian territory. With regard to the Democrats, the letter of annexation protest signed by most, but not all Democrats, reveals that they oppose annexation because they believe it endangers the so-called two-state solution, while ignoring that their concept of a two-state solution does nothing to address equal rights and the ongoing denial of Palestinian self-determination. You can see, for example, and you can Google these letters, the letter to Netanyahu and Benjamin Gantz, dated May 21, 2020, signed by Connecticut Senators Chris Murphy and 18 other Democratic senators. You can also see a similar letter to Netanyahu and Gantz dated June 25th, signed by 191 Democratic congresspersons. You know, of course, the politicians don't quite say it that way because they ignore Palestinian human rights and the ongoing Israeli military occupation of Palestine. In criticizing Israel's planned annexation under cover of Trump's steal of the century, they are painfully careful to remind Netanyahu that, quote, we write as American lawmakers who are longtime supporters based on our shared democratic values and strategic interest of Israel and the US relationship. We firmly believe in and advocate for a strong, secure, Jewish and democratic state of Israel. We remain steadfast in our belief that pursuing two states for two people is essential to secure Jewish democratic Israel, and so on and so forth. Their hand-wringing over the two-state solution is tragically ignorant, if not outright racist. Most educated observers have recognized that as a consequence of Israel's ongoing creeping annexation, the so-called two-state solution is long dead. One such former proponent of the two-state solution is Professor Ian Lustig at the University of Pennsylvania, and author of several publications concerning Israel-Palestine. His latest book, which is worth reading, published in 2019, is titled Paradigm Lost: From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. Another is liberal Zionist and well-respected journalist Peter Beinart. His recent essay, published July 7th, 2020 in Jewish Currents, is titled Yavne, A Jewish Case for Equality in Israel-Palestine. This too is well worth reading and details his evolution in thinking, ending his long-held embrace of the two-state solution. A very different and somewhat better criticism of Israel's ongoing planned annexation is the letter dated June 30th to Secretary of State Pompeo, signed by 13 progressive Democrats, including all 4 members of the squad. This letter warns, quote, "Should the Israeli government continue down this path of annexation, we will work to ensure non-recognition of annexed territories, as well as pursue legislation that conditions the $3.8 billion in U.S. military funding to Israel in order to ensure U.S. taxpayers are not supporting annexation in any way," unquote. Well, this letter is so much better than the pablum spewing from the one that was signed by the 191 Democrats, including our 5 Connecticut congresspersons, Larson, Courtney, DeLauro, Himes, and Hayes. It's also problematic because it acts as though annexation is something new, something hatched by Trump and Netanyahu. It fails to address that annexation of Palestinian territory and resources is in the DNA of the Zionist Jewish state and has been ongoing in one form or another since the birth of the State of Israel on May 14th, 1948. I'm going to review some of the ways that Israel's been annexing Palestinian land and resources, but first I want to drop back for a bit of history. In 1900, Palestine had been under Ottoman rule since 1516. Less than 5% of Palestinian population was Jewish, and for most part, those Palestinian Jews lived in harmony with their Palestinian Arab neighbors and had no interest in the nascent Zionist movement emerging among European Jews. The European Zionist movement looked for a homeland in which to escape European anti-Semitism, and they initially considered Uganda and Argentina, but eventually settled on colonizing Palestine. They began emigrating to Palestine and raising money to purchase Palestinian land. The Zionist goal of colonizing Palestine gained great power backing with Britain's Balfour Declaration that was issued November 1917. This settler colonial endeavor ascribed national rights to the Jewish people in a land where the indigenous Palestinian Arab majority constituted 94% of the population. The British Army occupied Palestine in December 1917, a month after the issuance of the Balfour Declaration. Thereafter, a League of Nations mandate approved in 1922 granted Britain the authority to administer Palestine in sacred trust until it was to become an independent state. The vast majority of Jews living in pre-1948 Palestine emigrated there from Europe during the previous 25 years under the British mandate. On 29 of November 1947, the United Nations partitioned Palestine, and although the Jews in Palestine at that time constituted only 30% of the population and only owned 7% of the land, the UN granted 56% of Palestine for a Jewish state. Jewish militias intent on taking more Palestinian land attacked Palestinian villages and drove Palestinians from their land. This was the precursor to annexation. One such infamous attack occurred on April 9th, 1948, when the Irgun and the Haganah, Jewish terrorist militias, attacked the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin, slaughtering more than 100 Palestinians, mostly women, children, and elderly. On May 14th, 1948, Britain relinquished its mandate over Palestine, disengaged its forces, and the Jewish Agency proclaimed the State of Israel. 4 Arab armies thereafter entered mandatory Palestine, but Jordan's Arab League and Iraq's forces took up only defensive positions and never entered the UN partitioned Jewish borders. The Israeli forces outnumbered, outgunned, and quickly defeated the Arab armies. By the end of the war, 1949, the new state of Israel now controlled 77% of Palestine, all but the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In the process, this war displaced 750,000 Palestinians and destroyed over 500 Palestinian villages. Palestinians referred to this as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. Annexation was well underway. Israel's absentee property law of 1950 allowed Israel to take control of any property whose owners lived in the, quote, the enemy state, and was used to confiscate the lands and homes of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who had been made refugees by the assault of the Jewish terrorist troops on the Palestinians. In 1967, Israel conquered the Syrian Golan Heights and the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank and Gaza, constituting only 22% of former Mandate Palestine, was internationally acknowledged to become the Palestinian state in the so-called two-state solution. In contravention of international law, the state of Israel immediately began colonizing the Palestinian West Bank territory and Gaza territory, building settlements throughout. The settler population in the West Bank and East Jerusalem grew from 1,500 in 1972 to 520,000 in 2011 and to more than 750,000 in 2019. In 1980, Israel annexed East Jerusalem. In 1982, Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Baron Benvenisti warned that it was, quote, 5 minutes to midnight for the two-state solution because 100,000 Jewish settlers would soon inhabit the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But Israel kept colonizing the West Bank, and US Congress kept giving Israel more aid than to any other nation. In 1993-95, under the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into 3 zones. Zone A was roughly 20% of the West Bank that was to be under Palestinian Authority control. Zone B, roughly 20% of the West Bank, was to be under a form of joint control between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In Zone C, 60% of the West Bank fell under Israeli control. The Accords envisioned that Israel's control would be temporary and fade away within a period of less than 7 or 8 years, but that never occurred. By 2000, when the settler population in the West Bank and East Jerusalem exceeded 365,000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak proposed that Israel annex 9% of the West Bank. In 2002, Israel undertook to build a separation barrier cutting deep into the West Bank and expanded Israel's annexation of Palestinian land. 85% of this wall is well within West Bank territory, in some locations reaching as much as 11 miles into the West Bank, creating a seam of Palestinian land constituting some 9% of the West Bank territory on the Israeli side of the wall. This large seam of land is cut off from the rest of the West Bank, effectively annexing that land. When completed, the wall will extend 440 miles, 85% of it inside West Bank Palestinian territory. Although the International Court of Justice, in its 2004 advisory opinion, ruled that the wall and Israeli settlements within the West Bank breached international law, US lawmakers kept giving Israel more aid, more political cover, and placed no restrictions on that aid at all. And now, in much the same way, the Trump-Netanyahu peace plan, if implemented, will effectively annex another 30% of the West Bank. For the past 53 years, Israel has held the West Bank in military occupation. In defiance of international law and with US complicity, Israel chose to colonize the territory with its Jewish citizens. Since 1967, in contravention of international law, Israel has built 130 settlements and about 100 outposts throughout the West Bank. And some of these settlements, when you see them, they're like large cities. The Zionist plan has been to take as much land with as few Palestinians as possible, and they continue down this path. If the Democratic Party's newfound concern for annexation were sincere, it would tie justice conditions to the billions in aid given to Israel to reverse and stop annexation. But Congress, with overwhelming bipartisan support, continued to reward Israel $3.8 billion per year without any conditions to end the occupation, stop the annexation, or achieve a just peace in which all of the people of Israel and Palestine can live in peace, freedom, justice, with equal rights for all. It's going to take a strong international effort guided by the growing BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, to stop annexation, to properly address the Palestinian refugee crisis, and achieve peace, freedom, and justice and equality for all the people between the river and the sea. Friends, there is an awakening in America today, but there is much work to be done to bring peace and justice to this world. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, John. We appreciate the talk. Up next, we have Alicia Strong from the New Britain, excuse me one second, the New Britain Racial Justice Coalition, and also a graduate student at Yale.
I am going to share my desktop. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great.
Yes.
Cool. So thank you so much for having me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about internationalism and global solidarity. So my role in this panel is kind of bringing things together and understanding how the systems that are connecting these different things that are happening across the United States, but also globally. So my research at Yale primarily focuses on the proliferation of global racism. So I operate from the fundamental idea that systems like capitalism, neoliberalism, racism, these are global and transnational systems. So I'm going to start by sharing a video with you all. Hold on. So for a little bit of background, this video is about a company called Safariland. Safariland is a company that manufactures tear gas.
Danger of pulmonary edema.
Can you guys hear the sound? Okay.
Danger of disturbed cardiac rhythm. Danger of convulsion. Danger of impaired breathing. Danger of cerebral edema. Several members of our team have experienced the effects of tear gas. One was amongst the Turkish citizens who protested in Gezi Park in 2013. During the nationwide protests that followed, Turkish police fired 130,000 tear gas grenades. While tear gas is banned from use in war, governments use it to suppress the right of civilians to collectively protest in public space. Safariland sells tear gas grenades around the world. We have found evidence of its use against civilians in the US, Turkey, Peru, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Yemen, Bahrain, Tunisia, Guyana, Venezuela, Egypt, and Canada. After we train our classifier on synthetic images, we will deploy it to search for real ones, leveraging tags and keywords. The system returns a percentage for each image, indicating its confidence that the highlighted pixels signify a triple chaser tear gas grenade manufactured by the Safariland Group. In 2017, the Claris Corporation, of which Kanders is executive chairman, purchased the US manufacturer Sierra Bullets for $79 million. As part of our investigation, we discovered that Sierra's open-tip Match King bullets, seen here, are used by Israeli Military Industries, or IMI, the preferred supplier of ammunition to the Israeli army. We worked with activists to gather cartridges on the Israeli side of the Gaza border. What they found shows that the Israeli army fired IMI ammunition into occupied Gaza. Between March and December 2018, Israeli snipers killed 154 civilian protesters on the Palestinian side of this border fence, including 35 children. More than 6,000 were wounded. A member of our team was at the protests in Gaza and gathered this footage with local filmmakers. The UN concluded that the actions of Israeli soldiers during that time may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. We contacted Sierra to ask if their bullets are used by the Israeli army.
Are you still there with me, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. As far as how our product is being used by other companies, I've told that it's confidential and it's not information that I can give out.
We shared our findings with the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, who served Sierra Bullets with legal notice, warning that the exports of their bullets to Israel may be aiding and abetting war crimes.
So I shared that video for a couple of reasons. I mean, first off, the Sierra Bullets and Safariland, the two companies that were mentioned in that video for making tear gas and making those bullets, the person who's the CEO and who has profited off of both of those companies lives here in Connecticut. So he lives in Greenwich, Connecticut. He hoards his wealth here in the state. And essentially, he has made his wealth off of the brutalization of people, primarily people of color. So you saw the video pointed out in particular how these bullets and this tear gas is deployed in Israel and in Palestine. But these bullets have actually been found in a lot of different places. They mentioned Turkey in the beginning. Here in the United States, Safariland tear gas was found at Ferguson. Safariland tear gas was deployed against women and children at the US-Mexico border. And the person who is profiting off of all of this violence lives here in Connecticut. And so I started with that example because I really wanted to emphasize the way that these things are connected, the way that global connections can take us from the US border to Ferguson to Palestine and then back to Greenwich, Connecticut. So to continue, I just kind of wanted to talk about internationalism, which is kind of the main premise of my presentation. So in a globalized world, our movements have to be internationalist. We can't continue to organize under nation state lines. We have to see collective liberation beyond the nation state. And that's because these systems that we're talking about, these systems of oppression, whether that be capitalism, whether that be racism, whether that be sexism, these things don't just operate in individual countries. These things are not restricted by any international borders. These things are global. And because of that, this needs to be our approach when we're doing activism, even at the local level. And again, I think that the video that I just showed you really exhibits the ways that these different systems, in particular for this video, the ways that capitalism, racism, and imperialism bolster each other. So I know that sometimes there's a tendency to think of these things as completely separate things, but as activists, as people who are trying to build movements, it's important that we always think about these things together. So next, I want to talk just a little bit about the global Black struggle, because just as racism is globally pervasive, anti-Black racism as a particular form of oppression is pervasive. And we see that in particular among Black Jews in Israel. So this picture is from a protest against police brutality in Israel. Black Jews in Israel, I believe, are primarily Ethiopian Jews, and they have faced very similar racial violence from police in Israel as Black Americans in the United States. And I think, kind of to bring the connection back around, we should also think about the connection between US police departments and training programs in Israel. So across the nation, there have been police officers who go to Israel and are basically trained by the IDF. And I think, as was mentioned a little bit earlier in the introduction to this webinar, a lot of these programs seem to be premised on the dehumanization of those who are perceived as the enemy. And so this picture in particular is shocking, because you see the parallel between the American police putting their knee on George Floyd's neck, and here in Israel, you see the police putting their knee on the neck of a Palestinian. So that is another kind of point of connection when we're thinking about racial violence in Palestine at a global level. And so I want to conclude by encouraging us as activists, as people who I hope truly want to build solidarity with oppressed people around the world, just a few different things that we can do to build that solidarity, because it's more important than ever, especially at a time when white supremacy in particular functions to separate oppressed people. So the first thing is learning each other's history. You cannot understand oppression of anybody without understanding their history. It is a socio-historical process of how people get racialized and how oppressions and racial projects are formed. And so it's so important that we learn each other's history. So that means Indigenous history, that means Latinx history, that means the history of Palestine. That will provide us with a lot of context through which we can work together. The second thing that I would say is we need to recognize that while oppressions are interconnected, that doesn't mean oppressions are all the same. So I think a lot of people make the mistake of drawing comparisons between different oppressions and then trying to rank them or trying to equate them. And doing something like that can be much more harmful than positive. So as we're building these connections, as we're trying to connect movements like the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and Palestinian liberation abroad, we have to keep in mind that oppressions function differently for different people. And I think the last one goes without saying, this idea of insisting on collective liberation. So like I said before, a lot of these systems of oppression operate by dividing people. So that if they can get you to only support your own issues and not build any type of solidarity across marginalized groups, ultimately it's weakening everyone. So as we continue, both in the United States and globally, to fight for liberation of the working class, women's liberation, Black liberation, Palestinian liberation, we have to insist on doing it together. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. We really appreciate it. Up next, we have Adam Antar, recent graduate from UConn School of Law and a community activist. Adam, take it away.
All right, thanks everybody. It's excellent to be sitting here with a great panel. I know John has been really pushing the work with Tree of Life Educational Fund And I highly recommend that if anybody's looking to become active, to reach out to him. And Alicia has been doing amazing work, especially in this current American Intifada, as I'd like to call it. So there's three things I want to do here. Essentially, one is offer an update on the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians due to the current annexation plans. Although that the previous two speakers did do an excellent job of that. I want to offer a framework of how the various struggles that we're witnessing right now can fit together in a form of solidarity. And then really I want to offer tips for activists, people who want to become advocates for this issue. I want to offer kind of my 2 cents in terms of how I've negotiated with the pushback when you were trying to do the work for Palestine. So yeah, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to try to load up here. Let's see if I can do this. Is that working?
Yep.
All right. So the first thing I kind of want to point out is, I mean, we've all seen this map. You know, this is the classic map, Palestinian loss of land from 1946 to 2000. If you've ever done any kind of Palestinian advocacy work, you've seen this map. I'd just like to point out, though, that it's incomplete. Some of the first Jewish immigration to Palestine started in 1882, and it was due because of anti-Semitism within Europe and Russia. And the push to create a state for Jewish people was this idea of the Jewish people need a state to protect them from violence, from anti-Semitism that had occurred in Europe. I mean, obviously culminating in the Holocaust, but there was a long history of anti-Semitism through Europe before then. Okay. And as time goes on, 1948, the state of Israel is created, and they launch a war between the Arab countries and the state of Israel. 1967, the state of Israel attacks Egypt and is able to take over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It wasn't for years until they're able to slowly negotiate in the first set of Oslo Accords, a set of parameters that would set up future negotiations. And then Oslo II is where we have this idea of separating the different layers of Palestinian control. So here in Area A is where the Palestinians have full control. It's largely in the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. Area B is Palestinian administration, but Israeli security. And Area C is still to be negotiated, which essentially just means that it's full Israeli control. And currently, they use Israeli law rather than Palestinian law. This is just another image of what's happening between 1967 and 2017. I know John started talking about the Bantu stands that occurred in South Africa, about how different areas within South Africa were set up to kind of divide different ethnic groups to say this is where the indigenous African populations can have their set of autonomy, whereas the rest of South Africa is going to be controlled by this white supremacist settler colonial government. And it is obviously very similar the way that we see when we look at what's happening in Palestine and the West Bank. Not only that, but John also mentioned that it's similar to the way that the United States works. And these are the reservations within the United States. We can't separate, I believe all of us are sitting here in the United States. We're sitting in a land of settler colonialism. And it's important to remember that this is not something far removed. We are sitting here and essentially reaping the benefits of settler colonialism in that capacity. So when we look at Palestine and when we look at South Africa and their histories, we shouldn't set ourselves apart. Something else that was discussed that I think is really important that was leading up to this plan for annexation was the Trump peace plan, this so-called deal of the century. And essentially, it really does set the stage for annexation. What was interesting about the deal of the century is that it was put out during Trump's impeachment proceedings, and it was pretty much instantly thrown off to the side. It was thrown off to the side because it was not critical enough of what was happening of the Israelis. And the Israelis didn't, especially the hardline right-wing Israelis, didn't like it because it created a Palestinian state. So basically, both sides rejected it, which is indicative of kind of the stalemate that we find in the peace process, period. If you'll look at this map, I'm going to try to blow it up a little bit. But you can see that these red circles that are filled in with yellow, those are Palestinian villages, those are Palestinian cities that fall under Israeli control. So essentially what that means is that if you have a Jewish state, one that is built off of the idea of a Jewish identity, and in order to maintain that identity, if you want to live in a democracy, you need to have certain citizenship laws. It becomes a system of apartheid. It becomes a system where one group of people cannot enjoy the full rights and accessibility to the government, to the state, strictly because of their identity. Annexation will continue that plan. Annexation beginning from 1882, largely militarized in 1948, and consciously recognized by the West in 1967. It has been an ongoing process, and we're continuing to see it today. And the ramifications is the continued subjugation along ethnic and religious lines of the Palestinian people. So to be clear, this annexation plan was set to begin July 1st. We're sitting here July 30th, and nothing has really happened. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the main reasons is that it was never really a legitimate plan. It was simply something made for the election cycle for Netanyahu to rein in some of the right-wing hardliners. Annexation is a slow creeping process. That is the plan, to exist at this level of colonization, settler colonization, imperialism, and violence to this degree in this era, so openly while everybody is watching, cannot be done in the same old ways that it was done in 1948 and 1967. It can't be done in the same way of South Africa. The world has seen too much, so it needs to change. That was simply made. It was a statement by Netanyahu. It was a plan by the right-wing government to help assure essentially the settlers in Israel, we're still on your side. We still want to support you. The opposition leader Gantz had even said that he knew that it was an election lie because Netanyahu was ready in 2014 to pull some of the settlers out. And following Israeli politics, the way that they have their multi-party system, they need, in order to get like a coalition government, they had 3 different elections this year because they couldn't get a clear majority. So in order to do that, Netanyahu used this idea of we're going to continue this annexation. Also, it's important to understand that this is a clear violation of international law. So the purpose of international humanitarian law really doesn't have anything to do with people. It has everything to do with ensuring that the borders that we have now are maintained. It's about the status quo of coming out of the First World War and especially after the Second World War, saying that it's a plan for Europe to say, we're not going to mess with each other anymore because we've seen what bloodshed and war and like integrity of borders and the lack thereof can lead to. And that was the basis of international humanitarian law. So the cornerstone of international humanitarian law is this idea that we cannot allow conquest, the taking over of land via conquest, to be legitimate anymore. It is a violation of the UN Charter. Many people from the UN, this is Michael Link, but there's a quote by him that says the international law is very clear. Annexation and territorial conquest are forbidden by the Charter of the United Nations. And the Security Council beginning with Resolution 242 and 67, expressly affirmed the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war or force on 8 occasions. And they've done so specifically with regards to Palestine. So again, why is this happening? We talked about the need, this idea of salvation for Jewish people facing anti-Semitism in Europe. You know, and I'm going to talk about that clearly when we talk about what activists need to know in order to ensure that they are not, if they're going to be careful with some of these charges of anti-Semitism. We need to make this clear that it has been, this idea of annexation has been a part of the plan from the get-go. So here's a quote by Moshe Dayan, Chief of Staff of the Israeli military during the 50s and Defense Minister in 1967. He said during negotiations with Jimmy Carter that Israel had every right to be in the West Bank, and any division of the area is unacceptable. A West Bank Gaza state is not a solution. So from the get-go, so we're talking in the 1950s, at this point, Israel, the state of Israel isn't even a decade old. So from the start of this creation of the state of Israel, the objective was total control of Palestine. In 1972, the Israeli parliament the Knesset had decided that it was the right of the Jewish people to control the West Bank and everything beyond it. I'd like to point out, you know, before I went to law school, I was a political science guy, and one of the things that I focused on was mapping conflicts. And you can really tell that a large part of the push for annexation and control of Palestine entirely, it's rooted a lot in, again, creating a safety against anti-Semitism, a lot of religious background to it, saying that God chose us as the people and offered us this land. There is that kind of that historical narrative that they have, as well as, you know, this is military strategy. They need to have full control over the areas, because how are you going to have a state when there is a separate state within you, especially one that you are in conflict with? It presents major security concerns. So, and that is also the reason why they want to have this Area C, as we had seen here. I'll pull up the map again. Area C over here, because it prevents a buffer zone between some of the Arab states like Jordan and the rest of the West Bank and Israel. It is part of a military strategy. So I want to offer some framework for how we move forward, for how we think of what's happening. We need to be able to start calling it what it is. This is a white supremacist project. It's a white supremacist project because we can see the treatment of Ethiopian and Eritrean Jews within Israel and how they're treated. Recently, an Eritrean Jew in Israel was killed at an airport because they thought that he was a Palestinian terrorist. The state of Israel, we need to acknowledge that this is a white supremacist, not only creation, but a project. It was created by Europeans in order to ship off some of the less desirable Europeans. Their solution to anti-Semitism was not to deal with the racism and anti-Semitism that existed within Europe, rather to export a group of people that they didn't want to deal with. So essentially, the creation of Israel is not only born from anti-Semitism, but is a continuation of anti-Semitism, at least that is in my view. So how do we move forward? Join organizations. The Tree of Life Educational Fund, John is there. Follow better news outlets. You're not going to get legitimate news from CNN. Electronic Intifada is an excellent resource. We need to start when we realize that this is a white supremacist project. we also need to link it to what's happening. I really appreciated what Alicia was talking about in terms of the connections between who's benefiting, who's profiting off of these types of wars and conflicts and bringing them back home. And also she made that point of separating our struggles, understanding the similarities yet separating. And for me, I'm going to try my best to do that moving forward. But we do need to realize that, you know, the similarities with how the U.S. police get trained by the Israeli soldiers. We do need to realize that the exact methods of oppression that they use are similar to the way that police conduct is done here. While the Israeli military occupies Palestine, the U.S. police forces and other federal agencies occupy our cities here in the United States. Some of the creation of settlements and the way that Palestinians are forcibly removed by settlers, and they are replaced with Jewish groups, and sometimes these huge cities, they look beautiful. They're these lavish cities. What does that remind you of? It's militarized gentrification, and we should be able to realize the similarities. They are different, but they come from the same purpose. And all right, so I want to talk about activists and how we're going to move forward, because this is a very difficult topic. It's one of the most sensitive topics. It is something that you find, other than support for capitalism, it is the one thing that Republicans and Democrats can really get along about. So when we're doing this type of work, it does seem it's a very big uphill battle. And I'd like to say that there is some work, like Betty McCollum offered that bill to say that U.S. money cannot go to the militarized detention of Palestinian children. So I mean, that's a step forward. John has done a lot of work around that. However, when we're talking about it, we need to couch our language in this framework of anti-imperialist and demilitarization work. We need to frame it in these terms that don't necessarily single out the Palestinian cause, because it is such a difficult topic for a lot of people. And in that regard, I want to share an anecdote. Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut, he has done a lot of good work. I believe that a lot of organizations gave him an A, especially on his work around like privacy and stuff like that. And he's worked with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, but he would not budge on anything regarding Palestine. He went to an event at the Berlin Mosque that was put on by, I believe, some of the people who went on the Tree of Life trip to Palestine. And at that moment, he was confronted by many different people and a lot of different Palestinian activists. And there was a change in his attitude. It was the first time that I think anybody, a lot of us who were in the community and a lot of us who have been doing some of the activism saw a willingness to talk about the Palestine issue. So there is movement. It's very slow. But I think that by linking it to some of the greater American upheavals happening right now, this great American intifada that's happening, I think that we can push it even further. And lastly, the last thing I want to touch on is how do people deal with charges of anti-Semitism? Some of you may know that while at UConn last year, not this spring semester, but the previous one, we had attempted to put on an event on Islamophobia with Linda Sarsour at the UConn Law School. It was canceled by the administration. It came from the powers that be, from the then President Susan Herbst. And a lot of the reasons were because she's anti-Semitic. She's anti-Zionist, therefore she's anti-Semitic. And it's very traumatic when you're trying to talk about the oppression that you're facing, not even, and somebody levies an attack like that at you, and you know where it's coming from. And Linda Sarsour had said to me, or said to the group of us, that calling a Palestinian who's not even talking about Israel, calling a Palestinian who's talking about Islamophobia, talking about Palestine in general, and not even really attacking the state of Israel, that is an Islamophobic trope. So, we need to be careful, but we also need to be steadfast in our beliefs. So how do we deal with charges of anti-Semitism? I'd say the first step is to take a look at what you're saying. Be fair and honest. Think about what we're saying and say, is this coming from a place of anti-Semitism or bigotry or hate? Is it coming from a place of ignorance? I think that it's important for that first step of self-awareness. If we're going to be advocating for justice, if we're going to be advocating for equality, we do need to make sure that the things that we're saying and the places we're coming from are from there and not from uglier places. And the second step would be, why are they accusing me of anti-Semitism? Is it because of their misconstruing statements that are being said out of a genuine misunderstanding, or is it a legitimate attempt to disregard everything you're saying in an attempt to derail the conversation? And if it's the latter, push forward and ignore it. And that's the best we can do in terms of how do you deal with anti-Semitism. Be honest with yourself, be honest with the community, self-reflect, and at the end of the day, if you have done all those things and have gone through it well, then push forward and have no regrets. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate your talk. All righty. Up next, we have Dan Piper, who's a member of Socialist Resurgence and a candidate for state rep in the 1st District. Dan, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Oh, Adam, could you unshare your screen? Because I'm going to try to do the same. Awesome, thanks. Hi, folks. So this is interesting because I feel like I want to sort of historically elaborate some of the phenomena that Alicia has pointed out. I think this whole piece about the international character of everything is really important. There's other threads I want to pick up. But let's start with annexation. Both why it is being proposed now and why it hasn't happened yet. There has been all of this opposition to annexation coming from various areas with people who normally support not just Israel, but all kinds of extremely illegal and violent measures by Israel. So one opinion piece that appeared in the Washington Post by a director of Middle East Security at the Center for New American Security, and a guy who served in the State Department on the negotiating team on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, says this: unilateral Israeli annexation designed to demonstrate to Palestinians that Israel will not be held hostage to a Palestinian veto over its borders and territory would have a far more expansive effect. It would hasten the process of deterioration of Palestinian institutions towards further dysfunction and authoritarianism, as they would be increasingly seen by Palestinians as tools for Israeli occupation, not preparation for statehood. Eventually, this lack of legitimacy would cause the Palestinian Authority to collapse. So what is a guy from the American, everyone else on the panel here has very clearly pointed out the US supports Israel very firmly in everything it does. Why is a guy from the State Department so concerned about the collapse of the Palestinian Authority? Why is the idea of a two-state solution so important? At bottom, the so-called two-state solution is the last defense of the colonial settler state Israel, not just in world opinion, but to the Palestinians themselves. It is one of the key components that is enabling a neocolonial situation, not just in relation of Israel to Palestine, but in relationship between puppet regimes in Palestine, namely the Palestinian Authority, but also to a large extent Hamas. It is also key for allowing countries whose population is absolutely opposed to the state of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians. It is key for allowing their ruling class to stay in power. Ruling classes that have become much closer to Israel. So Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all of these have begun to work, for decades, have effectively had a collaboration with Israel, either directly or indirectly through their collaboration with the United States and other imperialist powers. But this collaboration is growing, and it depends upon this idea of a two-state solution, a solution which should have been clearly a lie decades ago. But in the present moment, where you have on the table right now, not just from Netanyahu, but also from Trump, and also various different proposals supported from other quarters, proposals not just to annex between 5 and 30% of the West Bank, but to set up a Palestinian state without any ability to defend itself, without control over water, borders, and most things that states actually do. The Gaza Strip, for instance, is the size, it's actually smaller than the city of Detroit. And it would be connected, according to one of these plans, maybe more than one, it would be connected to the West Bank by an underground tunnel. What is more dystopian than the idea of a state that has that kind of relationship, that people in an area that's basically the size of New Jersey being so at war that the only way to connect two neighborhoods effectively is through an underground tunnel. That's what we're faced with here. So I do want to get to the heart of this, why a two-state solution is not a real thing, and why the fight for a democratic secular Palestine, that is one state, is essential. And to do this, I want to talk a little bit more fundamentally about what we're talking about when we're talking about a nation state, where this comes from, what does it mean in this world, and I want to eventually get to what Alicia pointed out to, with the situation we have now where everything is internationalized and connected. Okay, so for the origin of the modern nation state, we must look at the origin of the modern economic system known as capitalism. And we can find the origin of both in Europe. So consider Europe before the rise of merchant capital. So we're talking Middle Ages here, 1000, 1100 AD. In many ways, life was highly localized. Most people never left their village or town their entire lives. They didn't necessarily have an allegiance to any kind of nation. They had more of an allegiance to a lord. Maybe they had an allegiance to the church, which was not exactly a nation. The rise of merchant capital meant a dramatic growth in connections between smaller communities, and at the same time, the growth of a social group with an interest in this greater connection. And at the same time, as Franz Mehring put it, quote, the merchant opposed to the universality of the medieval church a national feeling that had only been very weakly developed in the little self-sufficient communities of the Middle Ages. I always forget this, but the Middle Ages weren't just localized. They were unified to a large degree by the church. As people talk about Christendom, that's what they're referring to. And so you have all these local dialects. You could travel not very far, not understand the people nearby you, but the priests all knew Latin, and there was writings in Latin. And so that was sort of the universal language. And this new merchant class destroys both of these. As Mehring puts it, in world trade, the opposition between buyer and seller became opposition between nations. And so you have, with growing trade, you have these centers where trade accumulates. All the localities send their goods, their commodities into these concentration zones. Those concentration zones then send those goods out elsewhere. They don't just send them, they sell them. There are people living there who are basically stationed there who gain power by virtue of this location. So you have major trade cities like London, Paris. I don't know exactly all the details actually, but all the major economic capitals of Europe in the 1600s are related to this economic phenomenon. And then the entire region that is connected to these central points that he calls nodes, that whole region becomes connected. And so thus you have this drawing together, but then they're also opposed to each other because they're also in competition. So the localities become drawn together around a central trading point, and then the societies, the communities that become concentrated around that central point become in opposition to each other. And so then you have this kind of growing nationalism where there's a growing idea of France, a growing idea of England, and so on and so forth. It's an idea that is produced by the rise of merchant capital. But it doesn't end there, because in that period, we still have kings, there isn't democracy. And then there is the French Revolution, where a fight between the merchants, the bourgeoisie, and the nobility draws in the peasants and all the other oppressed groups, but especially the peasants. And in that fight, the bourgeoisie wins all of these gains. It doesn't win it on its own, but it offers, or people fight for, gains which the bourgeoisie agreed to, things like land, like the right to a trial by jury, even the right to vote. Everything that was associated at that time with now citizenship. And in exchange for citizenship, you served in the army and you protected the interests of the nation as a whole, which really meant the interests of your growing ruling class, which was the bourgeoisie. And this was very exciting to all kinds of peasants throughout Europe. Often they would greet conquering armies because they get these rights, and then something shifts. The bourgeoisie becomes increasingly more dependent upon directly exploiting labor, not just trading. And it starts mattering much less if you own your own land, because capital has all kinds of ways of dominating you, or you're thrown off your land and you become a landless worker. If you think about this for a moment, you can immediately see a difference in the United States. Because in the United States, there was no fight against a nobility to get land. Where did people get land in the US? They got them from the native people here. And that's one of the fundamental differences between this kind of nation state and a settler colonial state. Although they're obviously related. As Adam pointed out, it was the nation states in Europe that produced settler colonial states elsewhere. But more and more, the nature of being part of a nation, the nature of citizenship changes. You don't get so much. More and more being part of a nation state in Europe means you get maybe paid a little bit of a higher wage in return for being in the military, supporting this nation's military efforts, because a really important shift happens. We move from this period of young capitalist nation states to a period where capital goes all over the world, and Europe divides up the world, conquers the world, and now their nation states are imperialist nation states. They're based on plundering other nations as well as exploiting their people at home. And that's the era that we're still in. And that is the era in which Zionism is born. It comes out of this whole process. Now, at the same time, you now have the creation of a different kind of nation state, because imperialism doesn't just conquer other countries, it has to actually create some kind of political subordination. So now they create nation states that are not based on this kind of growth of an economy based on a local ruling class. They're actually, these nation states are cut up and designed to prevent economic growth, to prevent the growth of political and rights. Because the growth of political rights, the growth of economic development would create a challenge to the imperialist nation states that have developed in Europe, United States, and Japan. And again, this is where Israel enters the picture. So what's the deal with Israel here? You have to think about it. It comes from a period where because of the growth of imperialism, you have a growth of workers' movements and socialist movements that look at this world where the entire world is building everything socially, where the entire world is building things pretty much on a world scale. Very little is made locally. And so but the profits are appropriated privately, the productive property is owned privately. And so the idea emerges that the entire world should be united. Just as the rise of the merchant class posed in very concrete, organic, material terms, the idea that this nation of France or Germany or whatever it was should all be united, the emergence of a world working class poses a very concrete, material, organic idea in people's minds. Why is the world not united? Why are we all not working together? And that's why we all care about this issue. Whether or not you identify as a socialist, if you're watching this video, it's because you care about somebody who's on the other, who's not. I mean, unless you're actually in Gaza or the West Bank or right now, you care about somebody who's not in the country where you live or the place where you live. You might be a Palestinian in another country, but the fact that you care about Palestinians in Palestine means you have a global consciousness that did not exist 600, 1,000 years ago. So that's the period where Zionism emerges. And most Jews in Europe were not interested in this idea of Zionism. They were interested in the socialist ideas of fighting for a united world. There's another story about how that shifts, but let's look at what actually happens with Zionism. From the beginning of Zionist settlement of Palestine, the settlers have been at war with the survival of the native inhabitants. Zionist colonization started around the turn of the 20th century. In its first few years, Zionists used highly exploited Arab labor to build a Jewish-dominated economy. However, Zionists found that since Jewish labor could not compete with the local Arab labor, they rapidly began excluding Arab labor altogether. Now, here's an account of what that looks like. It's by a guy who considered himself at the time a socialist Zionist, because like many things at this time, if you wanted people to be attracted to an idea, you had to call it socialist. His name is David Hakohen. He was the leader of the Zionist workers movement in Palestine in the 30s and 40s. He said, when I joined the Socialist Students Club in London, there were English, Irish, Jews, Chinese, Indians, and Africans, all under English domination. Already at that time, I had to fight with my close comrades around the issue of quote unquote Jewish socialism to justify the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my union, the Histadrut, that we urged Jewish households to not buy anything at Arab stores, that we organized guards around the orchards to keep Arab laborers from working there, that we tossed gasoline on Arab tomatoes and broke Arab eggs in the baskets of women who had bought them. The Jewish National Fund sent Yehoshua Hankin to Beirut to buy lands from rich absentee landlords, and then we kicked out the farmers. It was all right to buy dozens of hectares from an Arab, but to sell, God forbid, 1 Jewish hectare to an Arab was forbidden. It really wasn't easy to explain. So that's just a snapshot of what this looked like. This is not, I'm not talking about 1948, not talking about the Nakba. I'm talking about settlement of Jews before that period, before there was an open war. So because of this orientation that you were going to replace the people who were living there with people from Europe, Zionists came to rely heavily on the British to protect their project. In fact, the founders of this movement were very open and explicit about this, that they knew they would need imperial support, whether it came from the British, the Russians, the Germans, or the Americans. First, they rely on the British. Today, it's more the Americans. They procured laws and declarations in support of their colonization, most notably the Balfour Declaration in 1917, as well as favored banking status and physical protection. Zionist police forces eventually collaborated with the British in keeping down native uprisings, which were fighting a dual colonization carried out by England on the one hand and Zionists on the other. By 1936, the Palestinian resistance came to a head with a general strike that held out for 6 months. By the 5th month, Britain cracked down on the resistance. They arrested strikers and blew up buildings, terrorizing the population. One incident alone made 6,000 people in Jaffa homeless. Despite the barbaric force employed by the British, they were losing to the resistance by 1938 and began to join with Zionist forces who then aided in crushing the rebellion. By 1939, 14,411 Zionist soldiers had joined this effort. It should be noted that only in Palestine was the Arab rebellion directed at any Jewish institutions, and that even there, the rebellion targeted institutions specifically related to Zionist settlement and avoided the native Jewish inhabitants. With the Arab uprising of 1936, the Zionists began to rely on a combination of walls and towers in their settlement. This design incorporates two features that have proven essential to the Zionist project: the wall to keep native inhabitants outside the colonial community, and the tower to dominate them. Let me actually show you what that looks like. So these are just some pictures. I learned about this from actually an Israeli photo exhibition. Maybe I can't. There we go. Oh, that was banned in Israel. And so this is, again, we're talking, this starts in 1936. Remember the Nakba, or the destruction of 530 Palestinian villages, the exile of 700,000 Palestinians. That happens in 1948. This is 12 years before that. So this is not something that like immigrants do, right? This is something a settler does. Somebody who wants to push people out of land, or at least dominate them and create something separate. And if you follow this basic design model, it goes right up to today with the separation wall, which Adam and John discussed at length, which is, you know, in this early stage, you have the tower and the wall around it, the Palestinians around the wall. Now, the wall is around the Palestinians. It surrounds them. So if you want it, for me, that is, if you want to understand what Israeli nationalism is, that image to me expresses it in a nutshell. And that is fundamentally incompatible with the liberation of the Palestinian people. Even before you had the slicing up of everything that we see today, and the threats of annexation, and the attempt to completely turn the Palestinian people into an imprisoned people, it should be clear, even at this early stage, that this was the formation of a kind of nation state that's incompatible with the rights of the people living there. Okay, I think I've taken longer than I meant to, so I'm going to go to my concluding remarks here. So let's now look at Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism, and how it's different from the kind of nationalism that has grown up in the imperialist phase. Arab nationalism is part of a larger phenomenon of nationalist movements that have grown in response to the oppression and exploitation of imperialist nationalism, and in the case of Israel, settler colonial nationalism. For this reason, they have this progressive potential that imperialist nationalism completely lacks. There's a trend, there's a tendency to seek unity with other oppressed nations who struggle against imperialism. And there's a tendency for these struggles to be led by, or capable of being led by, working people. And I want to say quickly why that is. So for instance, if you look at oppressed nations like Palestinians and other Arab nations, their industry and their business has been consciously underdeveloped by imperialist nations. And so thus their capitalist class is weak. It is not only weak, but it is dependent upon foreign capital and even foreign militaries. It tends to have a national narrow-mindedness when it does have a nationalist consciousness. And the capitalist class in these countries tends to fear the masses. Whereas the workers of oppressed nationalities there may be fewer workers in, say, a country like Egypt proportionally than there are in, say, the United States. But the workers in Egypt, for instance, are more developed under foreign capital than their local capitalist classes, because foreign capital has invested in Egypt, has invested even in Palestine, has invested in Sudan, so on and so forth. There is a more developed working class there than there is a capitalist class. And while Arab capital is dependent upon imperialist capital is dependent upon Arab labor. And that is true for all of these oppressed nations, is that imperialist capital depends upon them, which means they can destroy it. They can live without it. It can't live without them. And finally, the working class of these nations has an internationalist interest and an internationalist aspiration. It has common interests with workers in other countries. It can conceive of a world without borders. It can fight for greater international unification and international solidarity. And for that reason, the struggle in the Arab world, the struggle in the Middle East, the struggle in Palestine is more than just a struggle for national liberation. It is very likely, as the Arab Spring, I think, very clearly shows to us, it is the kind of struggle that can set off a working class movement around the world. And that's exactly what the Arab Spring did. The economic crisis of 2008, 2009 did not set off a working class movement around the world, especially not in this country. It was not until workers in this country saw the example of workers in Tunisia and Egypt and Syria that they decided to start fighting back as well. In Wisconsin, with Occupy Wall Street, and then eventually with teacher strikes. And I mean, I don't know how much I want to date back everything to this point, but it has had a profound effect on the consciousness of working people here, even without a revolution, even without a consolidation of power. So when we look at these struggles, I think we want to see that this is not just a situation where people are being miserably oppressed. This is a situation where a people who have been oppressed over many years have also learned to fight and have the potential to provide an example to working and oppressed people around the world. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dan. So that was all the panelists. We're going to open it up for discussion. We don't have too much time, but I think I'll take like 3 or 4 questions from the audience. I'll turn it back over to the panel, and that'll probably be the time we have this evening. So in the questions I have right now, so far just one, and that is, how does the national oppression of Palestinians relate to the oppression of Afro-Americans as an oppressed nationality within the, I assume, United States? What does the experience of the Bolsheviks teach us on this subject? Go ahead and throw your questions in the chat, folks, and I'll ask them to the panelists. But while that's happening, let's start with that one. Does anyone want to take that question up?
I can take it.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I think just following on my remarks, I would consider African Americans to be an oppressed nationality within the U.S. Others may not agree with me on this, but the way Lenin put it was, an oppressed nationality is somebody, is a people who are behind a border they did not choose to be behind. The way Malcolm X put it was, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us. And that reality has not, that the story that has followed from that has not fundamentally changed. And so both Palestinians and African Americans face imperialism. They both face a need to create national unity in order to organize to defend themselves from world imperialism. They both face the need to seek international solidarity to do so as well, which at the height of any moment of Black nationalism in the US, it has. I mean, all the way, I think even before Marcus Garvey, I mean, well, yeah, you could even go back to Hubert Harrison, but I'm sure it goes back before that as well. But from Marcus Garvey to the Black Panthers to Malcolm X, all of those sought international allies. And then also, I think, kind of following from some of the remarks I made, both of them do face a settler colonial nation. So what that means is that the country they are in has a population which does benefit from their oppression one way or another, or at least has historically done so. The formation of the American nation meant that white people not only could get land, but it also meant that they could buy enslaved people and make wealth off of that. And this does mean that on the one hand, you have to fight independently of people in this group at times, but in that fight, you can break their confidence in this national project. And the reason why is because capitalism is inherently drives towards crisis, and each succeeding generation is able to deliver less and less to even its privileged populations, especially when the oppressed nationalities win victories, because it means there's less to give. There's less concessions to give. And so, American white people, after the Civil War, you could get 160 acres of land, and you could get training in a land-grant college, you could get loans, and you could become a farmer. And then all those farms were destroyed over the following decades by economic competition with big capital. So now what do you get for being a white American? Maybe, well, in the early 20th century, you got home loans, which other people were not allowed to get. And so you built up wealth that way. But now there's been several economic crises that has destroyed that wealth. So what now do you get for being a white American? Well, you get Trump. I mean, that's all that's why he says, make America great again. He wants to promise something that white people used to get that capitalism can't even provide them anymore. And so when Black people fight back, like they have just in the last couple of months, there's all these white people who say, fuck yeah, I'm tired of this. I want to go with these people who have some vision of the future. And so both the Palestinians and African Americans have this sort of contradictory thing, a situation where they often need to fight independently, but in fighting independently, they can inspire and win over layers of the people who are supposed to be turned against them.
All right, thanks, Dan. Okay, so we have a couple other questions here in the chat. I'll read two of them and then I'll see who wants to take them up. One question is, one thing I would appreciate is if someone could define the term Bantustan. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. And the other is, what do people see as the way forward for a democratic solution for the self-determination of Palestine? One state, two states? What does this look like? And I will, who wants to take up either of those questions?
I will.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Go ahead.
So a Bantustan is a term that was originally specific to South Africa during the time of apartheid, where there would be, although that there was the total control of South Africa under the white supremacist apartheid system, the Bantustan was essentially like these reservations for the indigenous Black people that said that this is where they could have their territory. So it is it's analogous to a reservation that you would see here in the United States, or some of those little enclaves that you saw for Palestinian autonomy within the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. So it is from a larger, from like the greater state that included all the indigenous land, it is a small portion that is allowed for the indigenous population to exist on their own terms within certain limitations and parameters. Regarding the second question for what is the solution for a democratic self-determined state for Palestinians, I think a lot of the speakers today kind of spoke towards it, and a lot of Palestinians within civil society, whether they're in Palestine or they're abroad, have stated that a one-state solution is the only way forward. A two-state solution doesn't make sense. Dan spoke about how a lot of the functions of a state are not present or allowed within the Palestinian context. Any kind of state for Palestine moving forward under a two-state solution framework would, according to the state of Israel and a lot of the positions of the United States, would necessitate that they want to have a military. You can't have a state, quote unquote, without having the ability to defend your borders. So there will be no Palestinian state in that regard. There needs to be one state solution. It needs to be, so annexation is just, it's going to lead towards the inevitability that all of the Palestinians are going to be under Israeli control, and then the fight will essentially become for equality, for equal rights amongst the law. So that will be the formation moving forward. It will be the fight for one secular state, democratic state, not this type of faux democracy for one ethnic or religious group while the rest is under military rule. I don't know if somebody else wants to add on to that.
No, this is John. I would just add to that, the kind of emphasize the last point that Adam just made, which is, I think, the key point. Sometimes we talk about one state solution, and we don't talk enough about what is going on in that one state. I mean, in some respects right now, there is a one state already, but it's a very unequal and discriminatory state. So I don't really usually phrase it as a one state solution or a two state solution. I try to frame it more as a solution that provides for equal rights, justice, freedom for all the people. And I think clearly the two-state solution is dead at this stage of the game. It really never was alive. It's always kind of been held out there as an opportunity for Israel to just keep this eroding, creeping annexation process going. You know, at some point, you know, I think it did capture the imagination of the Palestinian people, but clearly that's waning now, because they recognize that left in these enclaves or Bantustans or whatever you want to call them, that they'll never have a state that has control of their own resources, control of their own air power, control of their own borders. When Israel talks about a two-state solution, they're talking about a solution in which the Palestinians don't have control of the air, don't have control of the water, don't have control of their borders, right? What kind of a state is that? It's not a state. And it's so annoying when interacting with our political leaders, our Congress people, our senators, when they keep on making what just seems like a really stupid argument at this point, given the history of what's gone on there, that, you know, we got to preserve the two-state solution. For what? You know, I mean, where has it gotten us, right? So the question, I think, really is not one state, two state, it's equal rights for all. I think that will ultimately happen in a one state context. Certainly will not ever happen in a two state context. So that's what I would add.
Thanks, John. Alicia, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, just want to make sure. All right, and I think this is probably the last question.
I just want to add something quick on that one right there.
Go ahead.
Just, I think, you know, one other way of thinking about the whole democratic secular versus, two-state Bantustan situation is, if you actually, oh wait, no, I want to back up on that. I'm sorry. I was thinking of a different argument that I was responding to in my head. But I guess what I would just say really quickly, though, is that it does, the two-state solution does serve to prevent people from fully criticizing Israel. And it does, it does play this important role in propping up the Palestinian Authority and other and regime. Without that, what would Sisi do in Egypt, right? Like people, that's one of the, I think, reasons why people blew up in Egypt was because of this frustration with the fact that the Egyptian government did not do anything about Gaza being bombed and many other atrocities. So I think that's part of the role there.
One other point I would just make, when they talk about the two-state solution, it doesn't do anything to resolve the discrimination that the Palestinian Arabs within Israel suffer. Israel itself, 20% or more of that of the state of Israel is comprised of the Palestinians that weren't kicked out of Mandate Palestine. So 20% of that population, and they're second-class citizens. Israel has built something like 700 villages and towns and stuff since 1948. Built almost no new Arab towns. The amount of resources, if you look at Jerusalem, the amount of resources that go to the Palestinians versus the amount of resources that go to the Jewish communities, it's way out of balance. So, again, a two-state solution without talking about it, put it in the framework of equal rights, doesn't really address the discrimination and the oppression that goes on both within Israel and, as a consequence, outside of Israel as well.
All right, thanks, John. All right, last question in the chat, and I think after this we'll go ahead and close this webinar. Is wondering if anyone could speak on how to counter Israel's attempts at pinkwashing themselves.
I guess I can offer something.
Go ahead, Adam.
I think that it's important to remember that, the discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces in Israel, globally it's not immune in Israel. It exists. I know that, the state of Israel likes to do a lot of propaganda by bringing openly gay IDF soldiers out to bring them to the United States and say, this is the only place in the Middle East where we can be safe. That's simply not true, because in the state of Israel, there is a lot of discrimination. There is a lot, it is based off of a religious state, and religion and LGBTQ communities don't necessarily go hand in hand very well, especially more orthodox and conservative ones, which tend to be the driving right wing within Israel. So I think that it's important to kind of acknowledge that, there are lots of cases of discrimination, as well as, you can say very clearly that there are LGBT movements throughout the Middle East. And instead of saying this is Israel's the best one in terms of progress, maybe it needs to be like, we need to support the LGBTQ community everywhere. It doesn't say that just because it's got more traction in one country, that makes it better. No, it's about ensuring that there's safety and equality for everybody everywhere. And, that goes back to the idea of, the creation of Israel as a solution to anti-Semitism rather than a continuation of it.
I've got a couple thoughts.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of this. We're going to give democracy to this one group of people, so that they will fight an army that will prevent democracy from being spread elsewhere. I mean, Israel helps prop up, the Israeli state helps prop up other governments that oppose LGBTQ plus rights. And I can't think, there's like I've read very explicit cases of this when democratic movements are successful in the countries that surround Israel, the state of Israel is threatened, because when people get their rights in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, what do they want? They want freedom for their brothers and sisters and siblings in Palestine. And the fight for LGBTQ plus rights is a democratic fight. It's part of that fight. It's part of workers' movements. And so, Israel is really actually fundamentally very good friends with Saudi Arabia. It's an ally with the US, which also, again, is a major opponent of democratic rights. So I think this through line of being for an internationalist perspective, international workers' perspective, means that, yeah, you fight for an international movement for rights of sexuality and gender identity and gender expression. And yeah, the Israeli state is not a part of that at all. There are Israeli workers who've won these rights, and maybe the Israeli state has been more open to granting them in exchange for this great persona and all of that, and getting a good PR campaign. But it doesn't fight for these rights. It's the working people who fight for those rights.
All right, thanks, Dan. Anyone have any last thoughts that they want to share before we close the webinar?
Yeah, just I would ask people on that are listening in to the webinar to please contact their congressperson and urge the congressperson to co-sponsor HR 2407, which is a bill that Betty McCollum introduced. Adam mentioned it earlier. But we've had extensive discussions with all of our congresspeople here in Connecticut. It's embarrassing that we have not yet been able to get any of them to sign on to this bill. We had Rosa DeLauro on it for 10 days, and then she caved to the pressure and got off. I had some very in-depth conversations this week with Alex Guinness, the legislative director for Congresswoman Hayes, and we're trying to push her onto this bill. But the bill simply says that aid that U.S. gives to other countries should not be used for the arrest and detention of children. And this is particularly critical in Israel and Palestine, where it's well documented by our own State Department, but by the UN, by Israeli human rights organizations, that 500 to 700 children per year are arrested, detained, and frequently those arrests are in the middle of the night, blindfolded, handcuffed, separated from their children, from their families, without any due process. And just to point out, in occupied West Bank, they're under military law, whereas the settlers are under civil law. So an Israeli child that throws a stone, may get a slap on the wrist. A Palestinian child may end up in jail for days, so these are issues that we should address. And it's also, when you couch an argument in terms of children's rights, it's much more easier to kind of break down the barriers that we often face when we're talking about Palestine, because as Adam pointed out, those barriers are certainly out there. So it's a good way of Somebody called it the introduction drug to Palestine, advocating for children's rights. But anyway, call your congressperson, ask them to co-sponsor HR 2407. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Anyone, any further thoughts from anyone on the panel? All righty. Well, this has been a webinar by Socialist Resurgence. We really give our heartfelt thanks to the folks that decided to participate on this webinar and join us and listen to these great speakers. You'll be able to watch this on Facebook. Find us on Facebook at Socialist Resurgence. There'll be the live stream is there. This will also go up on YouTube, again, Socialist Resurgence. And just so everyone's aware, Socialist Resurgence right now is running a fund drive until the end of August to continue to be able to pay for Zoom subscriptions and send folks in SR to various international gatherings and to continue to fund the kind of political work we do around the country. So if you have any interest in donating to us, we much appreciate it. That can be found at chuffed.org/project/SR fund drive. You can also find that at our website, which is socialistresurgence.org. And we thank you for joining us tonight. We much appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great evening and forward forever.